Hebrews chapter 11. I want to talk, had they been mindful, and Hebrews chapter 11. I'm going to start at verse 8. I got a little bit of a lengthy passage here to read, and on how they've been mindful. Hebrews chapter 11, and we're going to talk to you about, and you can listen along as I read, talking about Sarah and Abraham. It says, by faith Abraham, when he was called to go out, verse 8, into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance, obeyed. And he went out, not knowing whither he went. By faith he sojourned in the land of promise, as in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked for a city which had foundations, whose builder and maker was God. Through faith also Sarah herself received strength to conceive seed, and was delivered of a child when she was past age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. And I hope you do that also. Therefore sprang there even one, and him as good as dead, so many as the stars of heaven in multitude, and as the sand which is by the seashore innumerable. These also died in faith, having not received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and they embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims in the earth. For they that say such things declare plainly, if they seek a country, and truly, if they had been mindful of that country from whence they had come out, they might have had opportunity to have returned. But now they desire a better country, that is in heavenly. Wherefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he hath prepared for them a city. Had they been mindful. When I, having been here a little bit of time as pastor, and in an evangelistic church, and church that wants to help other churches that start here, a lot of guys who come here to start churches, I was able to talk to a lot of them. People who would believe like us and such, and because there's a lot of older churches here, but there weren't a lot of new churches started, and the churches that were starting weren't staying, and so because I started the church and then stayed, a lot of the older pastors would send the new guys to me, and because their churches, they might have been there 5 or 10 years, but the church is 40 years old or something, and so I talked to these guys, and I didn't know anything, and I was, just learning how to pastor myself, but I would talk to them and encourage them and kind of watch them come and go, because they come and go. I think I counted, before I was here 20 years, I counted 15 guys just right around here that tried to start a church and then went back and quit. And it's not the easiest area to start a church. It's not exactly the Bible Belt. And so there's not a lot of good methods. If you're not part of a denomination, it's a lot harder to start a church, because you kind of started on your own and stuff like that, but a lot of things. But one of the things I noticed when talking to the guys, and I started telling them, and I started seeing it and trying to stop it if it was that, is the guys who, what I called, had an umbilical cord going back home would almost never make it. What I mean by that, the guy would come and say, yeah, back home in Texas, it was so great. And, we had this in Texas, and back home, I still love that. My mom and dad lived there. I can't wait to go back and see them. And I always found that if they just, my pastor told me if it doesn't work out here, I have a place back in the church. I always knew you weren't going to make it here. You were too mindful of back home. It's like someone saying, Mom, I'm going to try to move out, but if I don't work out, I want to make sure I have a place back home. Well, he's probably usually not going to make out, because it's got too big of a safety net, and has that, and especially that too much affection for back home, and you could love back home. I love back home, but if you did not decide, I'm going to dig in here and get attached here where I'm supposed to be, and that didn't outweigh what you liked back there, the guy would say, man, back home, I've still got my house back there, and I always cringe. Say, man, sell your house. You're coming here, right? Good, buy a house here. You see that the mindset changed. My home back, oh man, it's so great. I have this and I have that, and I have a big old thing on my property, and I love out there, and I got cows, and I can't wait to go see. I love ranching. I say, you need to switch cows for cappuccinos in Seattle. Because you're not in Montana anymore, where the men are men and so are the women. You're in Seattle, where there is no man. And so you've got to switch things around here in your mindset, okay? And you got to change, and you got to start. You got to learn how to order a coffee with 10 words, buddy, before you're ever going to make it here. And you've got to learn to have the mindset of this, because you're too mindful of back home, and you're not attaching yourself and becoming what you need to do to be here. You haven't left stuff behind. You haven't burned your plows. And you got to decide this is where God put you. And inevitably, if they had the umbilical cord going back home, they went back home. Now, last 5 years, we got some good guys who stuck with it. And one of them told me, so what should I do? I said, buy a house. And he says, whew, like, we're having to get here. I said, yeah, you can't sell it for 2 years anyway. We know you'll be here for 2 years. And let's get you attached. And let's if God's called you here, then prove it. I don't want to invest in people who's going to come and go. And so that mindset is something that I want to I want to get in our mind there. In this story, it's Abraham and Sarah. Abraham is called out of the land of Ur, where he was from. Let's go back to Genesis. Let me go back to Genesis chapter 12. That's where he was from. That's where all he ever knew was. He had no Google Maps. He had no Google Earth. He had no way of finding out where he's going. He didn't know where he's going. He just said, go out, leave your country, leave your kindred, leave your people. I'm going to show you a land that's going to be for you and your family forever. And he just said, okay. Genesis chapter 12, and now the Lord said to Abraham, get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make thee a great nation, I will bless thee, and make thy name great. And thou shalt be a blessing. I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. And in these shall all the families of the earth be blessed. So he gets the first part of the Abrahamic covenant, and he's supposed to leave. And he's supposed to leave family, everything. And it's so hard to understand because we have maps, we have atlases, we have internet. But I'm talking on foot or with your camels, walk. You don't know where you're going to end up. You don't know what it's going to be like. If it's going to be forest, it's going to be desert. Is it going to be nice? Is there dangerous people there? Is there crazy animals? You don't know anything. Just go. And it says, verse 4, and Abraham departed, as the Lord had spoken unto him. And Lot went with him, and Abraham was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran. The faith that took is just amazing. And I think when we say faith today, I think we almost mean something different, because it doesn't matter. I can go to some odd country. Before I get to that country, I've mapped it out. I can't go to a place that my mind is strange as before, but I have to have an overhead view of where I'm going. I have to understand the layout of an area. Otherwise, I don't understand this. But when I go there, I'm confused the whole time. But if I got an overhead picture, I'll take maps with me of wherever I'm going, and I can zoom into the building. I can zoom in to the building I'm going to be in Africa. And so my faith, I'm going to be on a nice comfy airline, sitting there with a screen in front of me for 30 hours with people bringing me food, airline food, but it's edible in most cases. And I'm not doing what Abraham did. Okay? That is faith, and it's wonderful that he did that. God promised him a bunch of things in this passage and in others as he goes through Genesis. God promised him land, and that's what we'll focus a little bit on today, being blessed and protection with that blessing, that I will bless him that bless thee and curse him that curseth thee, and thou shalt be a blessing. Family, you're going to have a child. Even though your wife can't bear kids, and you're going to be the Messianic line. And in thee will all thy seed be blessed. It's a national thing. The family is national. It's one thing. And he's been given those things. He had some doubts. Let's go to chapter 15, because it didn't happen for decades, but he kept faith. And by the way, you go forward in the New Testament, in Romans and in Galatians, it tells this is a huge moment, Genesis 15 is in Abraham, because Abraham didn't see a way, but he believed God anyway. And in Genesis chapter 15, and God comes to him and says in verse 3, it says, and Abraham said, to the Lord, behold, to me thou hast given no seed, and lo, one born in my house is mine heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came unto him, saying, this shall not be thine heir, but he shall come forth out of thine own bowels, shall be thine heir. And then verse 6, and he believed in the Lord, and he counted it to him for righteousness. So he had some doubts. He says, hey, you said I'm going to have kids. I haven't had kids yet. I'll just use this. One of my servants has had a child, and we'll use that as my heir. That's what we do in our tradition. He says, no, you're going to have a child from you and Sarah. And they were getting old, but he said, you're going to do that. And he said, okay, I believe you, God. And so he believed God and continued to stay faithful to God through wondering and not understanding. His family was to be given the land of Canaan. Let me go back in Genesis 15 here. This Canaan land, the land of Israel, he was going to be given that. And verse 18, it's added on there. In the same day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, unto thy seed have I given this land, from the river of Egypt and the great river, the river Euphrates. And that's a massive land, and he gives the parameters more and more. But it's bigger than what Israel is proper right now. But it's a big land all the way to Iraq is where it goes, and to the Euphrates River. And it's a massive land. And God promised him and his family that land, and he says, I'm going to give it to you, and I'm going to give it to you permanently. Chapter 17 and verse 8. And I'll give unto thee and to thy seed after thee the land wherein thou art a stranger, all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession, and I'll be their God. And so God's making this covenant with him. And so, let me go back to, let's go back to Hebrews chapter 11. Abraham has to leave it for a little while in Genesis chapter 12 and verse 10. You can look it up. There's a famine. He goes down there, has a lot of problems down there. He leaves Canaan land, goes down to Egypt, has some problems, goes back up into Canaan land, and is eventually his family's buried there and such, him and his wife and everybody, and does all those things. But that land comes into play here because it's part of faith, and Hebrews 11 is all about faith. And verse 14 it says, for they that say such things declare plainly that they seek a country. And truly, if they had been mindful of that country from whence they came out, they might have had opportunity to have returned. Okay? So they've got this country, and it's going to go from Canaan land, which is part of God's covenant, which is a spiritual thing for them. He's going to go into heavenly land and all those things, and that's for us, because it'll say that in this passage here. But they were supposed to be in Canaan land. That was what God gave them. But there was other lands. There is back home. There is Egypt that his descendants were going to go into. But his descendants were supposed to come out of Egypt. And he was not supposed to go back to But then the Bible, in the middle of that and all this faith that they had, it says, but if they had been mindful of that land of what they came out, they would have had opportunity to go back in. And they may have had opportunity, and then they would have gone back because they didn't let it go. They didn't say, this is my land now. This is what God has given to me. This thing goes for a long time. They get it. And Abraham accepts that and says, we are Canaan land. This is our land. And by the way, it got so deeply ingrained in the Jewish people, they were saying in 1930, next year in Jerusalem. Next year in Jerusalem. Every year they said that. And the Jews always, and even when the land was inaccessible to them, they were saying, we got to go back to Israel. We'll meet you in Jerusalem next year. Because it was ingrained in them, this is our land. But way back when, Abraham could have gone back to Ur. Okay? Joseph, his descendants, could have stayed in Egypt. And God put it into them not to do that. Let me go back to Genesis. Again, Genesis chapter... let's go to Genesis 24. So Abraham's getting ready to die. He wants his son to get married. And he says, you know what? I want you to make sure to his servant's going to go and help him after he dies to take care of his son and make sure his son finds a wife. And he gives him some instructions. And in Genesis 24 and verse 6, and Abraham said unto him, to his servant, beware that thou bring not my son hither again. Lord my God, which took me forth from mine house and from the land of my kindred, and which spake unto me and sware unto me, saying, unto thy seed will I give this land, and he shall send his angel before thee, and thou shalt take a wife unto my son from thence. And the woman, be not willing to go, follow thee, then thou shalt be clear from this thine oath. Only bring not my son thither again. Don't take my son back to where I came from. That's gone to us. He's here. I want him to be here. This is where God put us. This is an everlasting possession, it's called, for those people. And so if you follow in Genesis chapter 50, what happens, they end up going down into Egypt, and God told Abraham that they were going to go down to Egypt in Genesis 12, way before they went down there. In Exodus, at the end of Genesis, they end up down in Egypt. And watch Joseph in chapter 50 and verse 25. And Joseph took an oath for the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and ye shall carry up my bones from hence. And Joseph died, being 110 years old. Here's the funny thing. So Joseph dies, and they stay 400 years in Egypt. But Joseph told the children of Israel, don't leave my bones in Egypt. I'm from Abraham, and my bones go back to Israel. And for 400 years, they took care of those bones. Go to Joshua and to chapter 24. And so he's working. He's number 2 in Egypt, but he says, I know where I'm from. I know where I'm supposed to go. And I'm mindful, not of Egypt. I'm mindful of Canaan land. That's where we're supposed to be. God's got us here for a while, but he's got some plan for that, and he's going to part the Red Sea and do all the miracles in the future. In Joshua chapter 24, and end of the book of Joshua, okay, by the way, when they came out of Egypt after the Passover and crossed the Red Sea, they were carrying Joseph's bones. When they wandered around the wilderness, carrying Joseph's bones. When they went in, and all this time, they're carrying Joseph's bones for hundreds and hundreds of years. And verse 32, and the bones of Joseph, this is a long time later after Joseph said that, and the bones of Joseph, which the children of Israel brought up out of Egypt, buried they in Shechem, in a parcel of ground which Jacob brought of the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of silver, and became the inheritance of the children of Joseph. He went back to his family's plot of land after 400 years. Why? Because they kept their mind on Canaan. Okay? And that's what they had their mind on. Because they were not mindful of the old country, they were not mindful of their old life, they were not mindful of what God brought them out of. And mindful is important. Mindful is what you keep thinking about. Okay? And when the Seahawks played in the Super Bowl, okay, I was wondering very much, because we had some big Seahawks fans, if they could be mindful of what I was preaching. That's good. Or would they be mindful of the score of the second half? By the way, they should pause all Super Bowls until after Sunday night church, okay? And but what are they mindful of? What your mind keeps going back to? Okay, I know I have to do this, but yeah, okay, I'll do this. Man, I missed that. Yeah, I'll do this. I know I got to do this. This is my duty. Whew, man, that was so great back there. That was, man. If they had been mindful of where they came from, they may have a chance to go back. But they weren't. They said, it's gone, it's done. Just some lessons on this. Number 1, don't be mindful of your old life or your past. Don't be mindful of your old life, of your past. Abraham and Sarah, they said, we are going to be here. And you see, Abraham left the Ur of the Chaldees, and he said, God's got a place for me. God said, I'll take you to a place I'll show you of. Abraham somehow got his mind that heaven was in Canaan. And he said he looked for a city whose builder and maker was God. He got there. He found out it wasn't that. He lived in a tent. And he said, let me show you that. Let me get to Hebrews 11. He lived in a tent. He didn't inherit things. He saw the shadow of those things which were to come, but he did the will of God. And sometimes you don't get to see everything, but you get to be a part of it. And with what I just said, let's go back to, let's go to Hebrews 11. And verse 12, it says, therefore spring even of one, and him as good as dead, so many as the stars of the sky, a multitude, and as the sand which is by the seashore, innumerable. These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims in the earth. And for they which say such things declare plainly that they seek a country. For truly, if they had been mindful of that country from whence they had come out, they might have had opportunity to have returned. But now they desire a better country, that is in heavenly. Wherefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, and he has prepared for them a city. By faith Abraham, when he was tried, offered up Isaac, and so forth. And so he went and realized, okay, I'm seeking really a heavenly city, but God had me in this place. He has a work for that. This city is going to be where some descendant of mine someday is going to die in some city called Jerusalem, and I'm going to almost sacrifice my son, showing a picture of that thing. I don't understand all this stuff. I don't see the city of God until he died. And he says, but you know what? I'm not going back because this is where God's taken me. Okay, don't be mindful of your past life. You see Sarah and Abraham even with his descendants saying, hey, don't take my son back to Ur. He might go there and like it. God called us out of Ur. But watch Israel when they make this mistake in Numbers. Numbers, you'll find Israel making the mistake as they start looking back. They start looking back. And Numbers chapter 11, as soon as problems come, verse 7. And the mixed multitude, chapter 11, verse 4, the mixed multitude was among them, fell lusting, and the children of Israel also wept again and said, who shall give us flesh to eat? We remembered the fish which we did eat in Egypt freely, the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and the onions and the garlics. But now our soul is dried away. There is nothing at all besides this manna. Therefore, before our eyes, and manna was as a coriander seed and so forth. He started thinking about the old life. Chapter 14. Chapter 14, verse 2 through 4. They were mindful of where they came out of. They were looking back to Egypt. Chapter 14, verses 2 through 4. And all the children of Israel murmured against Moses and against Aaron. Would to God we had died in the land of Egypt. Or would to God we had died in this wilderness. And wherefore hath the Lord brought us into this land to fall by the sword, that our wives and our children should be a prey? Were it not better for us to return unto Egypt? And they said one to another, let us make a captain, let us return to Egypt. I want to say this, when you have not burnt your bridges back to your old life, and burnt your bridges back to the old bad relationships, and burnt your bridges back to the old sin, when you haven't burnt them, when the trials come, and when things go bad, and when your marriage is struggling, and when you are having a hard time in church, and when the devil's attacking you, your instinct is to go back to your old secure place, even though it was a terrible place. You were slaves in Egypt, Israel. You were slaves there. You were crying for reason of bondage. They were killing your firstborn. Every male child was murdered. But we had garlic. And we had melons. And we had leek. Half their problems are vegetarians. But they're sitting there saying we had this and this and this. And they're looking back and forgetting all the bad stuff from their old life, because the devil blinds one eye and says, hey, look at the good stuff, because there is pleasure, there is a time of fun in sin. The devil makes you only see half of the story, and don't think of the bondage. And when the trial comes, when you haven't burnt the bridge, you go back there. The devil says, just go back there. And it's an amazing thing. You can watch people who grew up in a chaotic, destroyed, messed up home, drugs and abuse and divorce and everything else. And then all of a sudden, when they try to rise up above, and when things get hard and challenges come and confusion comes, they run back to what they're used to, which is terrible, but at least it's comfortable and they're familiar. But you got to burn those bridges. You got to burn those bridges. Don't be mindful of your old life and your past. Look at it and thank God for taking you out of it. Don't look back and keep looking and keep the bridge. I mean, just keep that phone number, I'm old drug dealer. No, get rid of the phone of your own drug dealer. Give me your old drug dealer's phone number. I'll call him for you. Okay? But burn the bridge. Tell them if you come around me again, because I've had them get clean, I've had these people get off drugs, and the drug dealer comes back around and gives them free drugs. You know why, right? They give them free drugs and get them hooked again. I've had to call them and say, come back around again, I'm calling the cops on you. Got your name, got your phone number. This guy's trying to serve God now. Burn your bridges, because you'll go back, and the devil's going to bring him back. Luke chapter 9. Luke chapter 9. Luke chapter 9, verse 57. Every time you see something from your old life, preach the gospel to them, man. They're going to think I'm nuts. Exactly. They'll either get saved or they'll get away from you. But they will not stay around you if you preach the gospel to them every time you're around them. Luke chapter 9. Verse 57, and it came to pass as they went in the way, a certain man came to him and said, Lord, I will follow thee whithersoever thou wilt, whithersoever thou goest. And Jesus said to him, foxes have holes, and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man hath not where to lay his head. Prosperity gospel preacher never read that verse. And they said unto another, follow me. But he said, Lord, suffer me first to go and bury my father. Jesus said, let the dead bury their dead. Let's see if you'll look back. Let's see if you're going to cut everything and go. But go thou and preach the kingdom of God. Another said to him, Lord, I will follow thee, but first let me go and bid them farewell, which are at home at my house. Jesus said unto him, no man having put his hand to the plow and looking back is fit for the kingdom of God. When Elisha was called to go after Elijah, he went and he killed his oxen and burned his plow. He used his farming implements to light the oxen on fire, so he had no farming to go back to. He burnt the bridges. He got rid of it all. Number one, don't be mindful of the old life, of your past. Number two, be mindful of the Lord. Let me take it back to Isaiah chapter 17. Isaiah chapter 17. People need to learn to separate. People need to learn to burn bridges. They need to learn, and not good bridges, okay? But you still have contact with your family, but you want to witness to them. You're going to love them. But if your family's trying to draw you away from God, then you say, look, if you're going to do this, I can't do this. Some phone numbers you need to delete off your phone. Some friends you need to unfollow. Some people you need to quit respecting who are wicked people. Some books, some videos you need to burn. Isaiah chapter 17. Number two is be mindful of the Lord. That means keep your eyes going back to him. Chapter 17 and verse 10, it says, because thou hast forgotten the Lord of thy salvation, thou hast not been mindful of the rock of thy strength. Therefore shalt thou plant pleasant plants, and shall set it with strange slips, and continue, and it goes into God. The punishment comes. It says, look, you have not been mindful of the Lord. You know, when you're right, you're just thinking about the Lord all the time. Lord, how you doing? Lord, I'm sorry about that. Lord, that must grieve you. Lord, this is a beautiful day. Lord, thank you for saving me. And you're always thinking about the Lord. You kind of want to get away sometimes. Just talk to the Lord. You want to worship him. You want to play some music that's going to worship him. You can't wait for it to get in the Word so he can talk to you. You get mindful of God. You don't forget about God. You remember him on Sunday, then come back and next Sunday and remember him again. You're mindful of God. You're kind of doing this to God. You know what? I'm thinking about you, Lord. I mean, they're talking to me, but, oh, man, Lord, you're so good. Lord, I want you much more than I want that. Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full in his wonderful face. And the things of earth will grow strangely to him in the light of his glory of grace. Just after Hebrews 11 and Hebrews 12, it says, run the race which is set before you, looking into Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the Father. For consider him that endured such contradictions of sinners against himself, lest ye be weary and faint in your mind. How about considering Jesus, being mindful of him? How will he feel if I do this? Instead of, well, I like this, will I get away with this? How is Jesus going to feel? If I quit, how's God going to feel? He didn't quit on me. God is very mindful of you. I want to say you should be mindful of him. I'm going to take you to Psalms and show you how God's mindful of us. Psalms. Again, you don't have to turn to all these verses, but Psalm 115. God is mindful of you. He's thinking about you all the time. And yet, many Christians will go days without thinking about the Lord and how he's feeling and praying and talking to him or hearing from him. Be mindful of the Lord, because God's mindful of you. Psalm 115, these are beautiful verses. And verse 2. I got the wrong verse. 12. Psalm 115 and verse 12. The Lord hath been mindful of us. He will bless us. He will bless the house of Israel. He will bless the house of Aaron. Psalm 139, beautiful, beautiful chapter. And verse 17 and 18, God's thinking about us. It says, how precious are also thy thoughts unto me, O God. How great is the sum of them. How often does God think of me? If I should count them, they are more in number than the sand. When I awake, I am still with thee. You know, God's mindful of you. He thinks about you. He thinks about your burdens. He thinks about your battles. He thinks about your heartaches and your schedule. And he thinks about your loneliness. And he thinks about your battles and everything you're going through. He's mindful of you. And you should be mindful of him, thinking about the Lord. Don't be mindful of your old life and your past. Do be mindful of the Lord. And number 3, be mindful of heaven. Back in our text, Hebrews and chapter 11. We see this we see it in many people in the Hall of Faith in Hebrews 11. We see several people who get their mind on heaven. Otherwise, they couldn't have done these great things that they did. And we see in verse 13 through 16, these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and are persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confess that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For they say such things, declare plainly that they seek a country. And truly, if they'd been mindful of that country from whence they came out, they might have had opportunity to return. But now they desire a better country, that is in heavenly. Wherefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he prepared for them a city. Go down to Moses here in chapter 11. And verse 24, you'll see Moses doing this process. By faith, Moses, when he's come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, but he endured as seeing him who was invisible. Colossians chapter 3 says this, if ye then be risen with Christ, seek those things which are above, where Christ sitteth on the right hand of the Father. Set your affection on things above, not on things of the earth. Set your affection there. Be mindful of the heavenlies, of Jesus, standing in front of him, of your mansion, of what heaven will be like, of the rewards, of a well done, thou good and faithful servant. Have your mind on eternal things and be mindful of those eternal things, and set your affection on things above, not on things of the earth, for ye are dead, and your life is hid with Christ in God. And God says, hey, set your affection on things above. You need to put your affection on those things. But I noticed the word it says there in Colossians chapter 3, verse 1, if you then be risen with Christ, set your affection. That is taking and saying, I am putting my affection onto this. Your affection in natural wandering is not to be trusted. The heart is desperately wicked and deceitful. Your heart will not put itself on the right things. You must take your affection and set it on what you want it. Because if you let it wander freely, it will get attached to the things of this world, because it's the heart of flesh. So you purposely grab your heart and set it on things above and on heavenly things. That is a purposeful thing. You are choosing what you think of. If they had been mindful of those former things, but they chose to think about those other things. It says, consider him. That's a choosing of what your mind is going to be focused on and what you're going to love. Love not the world, 1 John 2 says. Love not the world, neither things that are in the world. That is a choice. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. So it's a choice you make of where you're going to put your love, what you're going to put your affection on, what you're going to love and desire. And you've got to take and say, you know what, I am not going to be mindful and put my affection, because you know what, on a bad day, I might be drawn back to that. But when your affection's on God and on heaven, on a bad day, you're drawn to God, actually. Not to your old life. When you burnt those bridges. when you say, I'm serving God no matter what. I'm going to keep on serving God. Being mindful of things that matter, because your mind gets forgetful, and I almost preach on forgetfulness tonight, but it's a different message. But you be careful to set your mind on the right things. We took a little mini vacation, I don't know, 2 weeks ago? How long ago was that? 2 weeks ago? And while we're down there, we went down to Lincoln City. While we're down in Lincoln City, I got the assurance of my salvation. I think that's when I really got saved and understood it, at a camp down there, right on Highway 101 near Lincoln City. And so whenever I go down there, I always stop by the camp and go by the place where I got saved. You know, it says in 2 Peter 1, it says, he that lacketh these things is blind and cannot see afar off, and hath forgotten that he was purged from his old sins. When you forget your salvation and lose the joy of your salvation, you're in big spiritual trouble. You got to keep that thing fresh. And so while we're down there, I took the family and we drove down there and we parked there, and I talked to people at the camp and told them who I was. I said I want to go back to the spot, and I took the kids to the spot. I tried to do it once a year. It's a 4.5 hour trip down there, but I like to go down there and just remember, sing some songs about salvation, that Jesus saved me. Otherwise, it gets kind of old. You remember, and Paul says, Peter says, 2 Peter 1 also, he says, I'm going to stir you up as long as I'm with you by way of remembrance. You know, God did amazing things in your life. He did miracles when you first got saved and delivered you from some things and was speaking to you and doing things, but you haven't remembered it much, so it's kind of just like an old foggy thing, and it's not giving you faith for today because you have not been set in your mind on the things you should set them on and thinking about the things you should think on. The devil says, no, you're going to think about your problems. You're going to think about what you can't have a solution for. You're going to think about what's not fair. You're going to keep looking that way. But if you'd ever remember back and choose to be mindful of, you'd realize God can take care of this. He's done bigger things than this for me. But when you don't think and put your mind and set your affections and set your mind on things, you don't do that. I found myself about maybe 9 or 10 months ago, I was in a little bit of a dry time, and I just felt like I would need to be drawn to the songs that I used to listen to when I first got saved that impacted me. And man, it's easy nowadays. Those cassettes are long gone. Okay? And, but there's this thing called the intranet, and www. whatever, and you can go on there and you can find any song. And I went and pulled up some old songs, and I found out there's something called a playlist, and I put these things on a playlist, and all of a sudden I started listening to those old songs. You remember how God spoke to me with those songs back then, and use music as a tool, not as entertainment. Well, that went quiet. What happened? Microphone go out? What happened there? I use the song as a ministry and a tool, not as entertainment. And how it brought back how on dark days this song, God spoke to me, and how this one taught me some good doctrine. And I remember, and I learned this about God. And that night when I was alone with God and just lifting my hands in worship and praising Him, how all of a sudden I got joy back when I was struggling. And I started listening to those old songs. Why? I was deciding to put my mind on things that it should put it on. And being mindful. For if they had been mindful of the old life, Israel was mindful of Egypt. No matter how bad it was, they kept going back. So, and it said, if they had been mindful of the country they came out of, if Abraham kept on thinking about, back in the era, my Aunt Ethel makes the best lasagna. Wish I could go back there. There would have come a time. And lasagna is almost worth it. You're getting tired here. You're like, really? Where's that in the Bible? And well, you are really out of it. And okay, pizza. I mean, something's got to be worth it. But all of a sudden on a bad day, Abraham's like, I'm living in a tent. I had houses back there. You know what? Let me just go back to, but they weren't mindful of Ur. He didn't talk to his kids, man, someday I'm going to take you back. No. God gave us this land. I mean, Isaac, teach your kids this. Isaac says, hey, man, your grandpa told me, you know, this is our land. Joseph says, don't bury me here then, in Egypt. Carry my bones around for 400 years. And they did. And so if they had been mindful, they would have gone back. But they weren't mindful. They were on track. And they're going to serve God no matter what. And if you'll do that, you'll finish serving God. But if you don't do that, the devil's going to get you on a dark day and take you back. And you're going to cross that bridge you didn't burn. Because it's still there. And you're going to regret it. And you'll go back from where God has for you, the wonderful land where God has for you, a land of milk and honey. Egypt wasn't so hot. And the Ur didn't end up being so hot either. It ended up being hot, but in the wrong way. It's Iraq and Afghanistan and, you know, all that stuff. And a disaster. So be mindful. And don't be mindful of the wrong things. Don't be mindful of those. The devil's going to get you to go back. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for your word. I thank you for this little blip, Lord. Maybe we need to be mindful of heaven and mindful of you and not mindful of the things that you brought us out of. And I pray that we'd burn bridges that need to be burned. Lord, I pray that we would decide that we're going to serve you till we die. And Lord, I don't know, in a mixed crowd of so many people from such diverse situations and backgrounds and situations, Lord, I don't know where they all are. Somebody needs to burn up an old girlfriend's phone number. Somebody else needs to burn the drug dealer's information. Somebody else needs to burn going back home, going back to a bad relationship, and somebody else needs to set their affection on heaven and whatever else, Lord. I don't know what all you have for us today, Lord, but maybe we're just not mindful of heaven. Maybe the old life calls to us some. But Lord, I pray we would not be mindful of those things. I pray that we would have our affection on things above. I pray whatever your purpose for this message is, because you said it wouldn't return void, but accomplish the purpose you have for it. I pray you accomplish that purpose while it was preached. And I pray tonight that each person that's maybe in danger, that maybe is going to go back to something they shouldn't have, Lord, maybe tonight that they would be like Elisha and burn their plow and their oxen, so they can go in the ministry and not in the farming. Thank you, Lord, for these truths. Help us to live them and love them and work in a great way. We pray these things in Jesus' name.